All right, welcome back once again, everybody. I'm Don Seifrit. It's the Dr. Tree Fruit and Don podcast. It is Tuesday, May 12th, 2026. I'm here with Dr. Carrie Peter. Say hi, Carrie.
Hey there.
And Dr. Sean Kumar. Say hi, Sean.
Hello, everyone.
Dr. Krawcheck is doing some family stuff this week, so he will not be with us. So it should be pretty short in the grand scheme of things with just Carrie and Sean. Sean, if you want to take us away, go for it, man.
Sure, Don, thanks. Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about this week and then talk about where we are sort of in the rest of the state. And so in Adams County, things are picking up, especially this week. Fruitlets are sizing up in blocks where you do have a crop. We are seeing fruitlets growing rapidly, anywhere from 7 to 8 millimeter to 15 to 18 millimeters, depending on how much you lost from the freeze event of April 20th, 21st. Depending on, if you just lost your kings or first laterals, your sizes might be a little bit bigger. If you lost a lot of the primary set and the secondary or lateral blooms are the ones that set, then you will have smaller sizes. In any case, this weekend is looking like the best chance for you to thin your crop. I think on Saturday we have warm temperatures, early low 80s, and that's going to stay that way for Sunday and Monday as well. And so most likely your crops are going to be in the 15 to 20 millimeter range. So larger fruit for you to thin off, especially since we've been waiting since 2 weeks, 3 weeks to sort of see what apples will stick, what apples are going to fall off. And so for in blocks where you do have a crop, this weekend is most likely going to be your last effective thinning window in Adams County. And so, if your thinning sprays from last week, if any of you had tried thinning sprays last week, last Monday, Tuesday, and I've heard some reports that it worked a little bit or it didn't work. And so, again, this weekend will be your option to thin your blocks. If and probably one of the last windows to thin your blocks because of the sizes of the fruitlets that are currently there. They're growing rapidly and they will continue to grow rapidly, especially this week. And with the temperatures forecasted as high as they are at 80 Fahrenheit, 6BA products can be unlocked like Maxell or 6 Barrel. They have peak efficacy between 8 to 15 millimeters, and they can be tank mixed with Carbaryl. If additional thinning pressure is needed, also I know some folks use oil as well. And so if as fruitlets are approaching 15 to 16 millimeters, if they're closer to the 15 to 16 millimeter range, then 6BA with Carbaryl is a great option to use. However, for fruitlets closer to 20 millimeters, when you get to spray them this Saturday, if they're closer to 20 than to 15 millimeters, then 6BA usually tends to be not as efficacious because it's slightly outside that thinning window for them to be the most efficacious to remove fruitlets. So for those fruitlets that you have higher fruitlet size closer to 20 millimeters, you want to think about maybe tank mixing with a seed. A seed is product of with an active ingredient ACC, which is a precursor of ethylene, and it can help. It is labeled for later season thinning, 15 to 20 millimeters. So especially with hard to thin varieties where you're using 6BA products, it's good to tank mix with a seed. And if you want a lighter thinning in the 15 to 20 millimeter size range, then you can with the forecasted high temperatures, you could also use a seed alone, which could result in a decent drop, and it's worth considering as a standalone option as well. So for very hard to thin, I would suggest still mixing both these chemistries to make sure that you're getting a strong thinning response. And for varieties in which you think that you just want a little bit of thinning, then a seed alone could also help do the job. Now, there's also the other product, the newer product that's been registered since late last year, which is Metametron or Brevis. And it is also labeled up to 20 millimeters size for thinning, and it does remain an option. Although for Metametron to be very effective, you want nice cloudy days following the application because that reduces photosynthesis, and as a result of reducing photosynthesis, that creates additional stress combined with the metametron application that results in thinning. But this week we are forecasted bright, sunny, warm conditions, so it might not be as efficacious. And nonetheless, if this is a new tool in your toolbox and if you haven't tried it yet, I would still suggest to try this in a certain section of your block to see how it works. Get your hands wet with some of these newer products that we have on the market. So that's the spiel for thinning. I know there's Ethafon is also available, but with the temperatures that's been forecasted 80 plus, with Ethafon you can really remove all your fruitlets if not used carefully. Ethafon is probably the best thinner when your fruit grow past 20 millimeters. Ethafon does a really good job, but you have to be very careful about the rates, with especially this high temperatures that we are seeing. And you probably want to reduce the rates a little bit, accounting for that high temperatures. But Ethafon will work if your fruitlets have passed the 20 millimeter size by the time you reached Saturday. Then you can think about using Ethafon as well, depending, and vary the rates based on the variety and your prior experience. But we've seen that it does a great job with thinning even when your fruitlets are past the optimal 20 millimeter size. So one of the more common things that we are seeing because of the freeze event is we are seeing two distinct sizes of fruitlets in your blocks. And then this question arises of what can we do if we do see two distinct sizes of fruitlets. So I'm assuming one from the primary set, where you have a few laterals left if you lost the king and first lateral, for example. And then you also have your, those were mainly set on the spurs. And then you also have your fruitlets that have been set on on the 1-year-old wood. And then basically what you have is two different sizes of fruitlets in the same block. And that's when you need to do some block to block level checking to try to see what sort of set you have in your primary set as well as in your secondary or lateral set in your 1-year-old wood. So in blocks where a lot of the spur flowers or fruits were killed by the freeze event, the bloom on the 1-year-old wood becomes the primary crop. And so you should base your thinning actions on the size of the fruitlets on the 1-year-old wood, if that's all you have or that is most of what you have in that block. And so for protecting this set, you need to wait until the king fruitlets in the secondary set or on the 1-year-old wood is at least 12 millimeters, because usually they can get very easily thinned off when you apply thinning materials before they reach that size 10 to 12 millimeters. By which point, if you think about it, the spur fruitlets are already sizing up to 16, 17 millimeters. So there's like a good 3 to 4 millimeter size gap, and much higher in some locations depending on the amount of damage that you had from the freeze event. And so the suggestion for those blocks is to wait. If your secondary set or lateral set the king of the lateral set hasn't reached 12 millimeters, then don't thin. Wait for them to reach 12 millimeters and then apply your thinning chemicals, and that will be useful. That will be helpful to manage crop load. And I do think that with Adams County, with both the primary and the secondary set, you will be at your prime thinning time this weekend. Even the secondary set is also sizing up. And by this Saturday, I think you will be at a place where you are able to thin. But please check your blocks to decide on the sizes. Look at the sizes, because based on the fruit size, you will have to decide on the thinning chemistry that you want to use. Now, if you had used Promelin or Perlan, one of these gibberellin and cytokinin products for improving fruit set after the freeze event, and you still have damage in those fruitlets, those fruitlets could still be growing, but when you cut them open longitudinally, you can kind of see that seed cavity sort of decaying. So these fruits are most likely going to drop, or sometimes these fruitlets can have other sort of damage, for example, some frosting or some russeting or misshapen development. And so both of these types of fruitlets are sort of hard to remove by chemical thinning, and you'd have to do some hand thinning later on after chemical thinning sometime late this month or early next month. You'll probably need some hand thinning to remove these sort of fruitlets if they've been damaged, because they're sort of hard to remove with chemical thinning. And so this is where we are at in most of Adams County and southern Pennsylvania. If you have blocks that are closer to the sizes that I've mentioned, then this weekend is probably your last bet. The temperatures are warm. They are going to be warm for 3 consecutive days at least. That's what the forecast says for Friday moving into Saturday, Saturday to Monday. That's what the forecast says. It's going to be 80 plus. So usually with those temperatures, you will be able to see some thinning action. Now, moving on to more central northern Pennsylvania, we actually took some measurements from some orchards to try to understand where the primary kings and primary laterals are, and where the secondary kings and secondary laterals are. So when I say primary, I'm talking about the spur king spur laterals, or the terminal king terminal laterals, and then when I'm talking about the secondary, I'm talking about the fruitlets on the 1 year old wood that I've set. So we did some measurements in a couple of varieties, and so for this in an orchard in Ellisburg, and so for Honeycrisp, we saw that they didn't have any primary kings remaining, but the primary laterals were about 8 millimeters in size. These were measurements taken yesterday by my student Michael. And if you look at the secondary king, it is around 2 millimeters less, at about 6 millimeters. And the secondary laterals are way smaller than the secondary kings, which they are only at 3 millimeters. And so, and similarly, we have Gala slightly larger. They do have some of the kings remaining, which are 10 millimeters, and the laterals, primary laterals, that following closely behind. But when you look at the Gala secondary set, they're at least 6 to 7 millimeters smaller in size than the primary set. They're only still at 3 millimeters, both the secondary kings and the secondary laterals. And so this just goes to show that each block there's something slightly different happening. And so this year you might need to pay a little bit closer attention to what sizes your fruitlets are developing at, in order to think about your thinnings, when to apply your thinning sprays. I mean, first, even if you want to apply a thinning spray, and then if you do want to apply a thinning spray, when to apply it, because these seem to be quite variable across blocks, even in blocks that are located right next to each other. And so, for example, in this particular block that we looked at of the Gala, there is a 6 or 7 millimeter difference between the primary and secondary set, whereas for Honeycrisp, it seemed like they were much closer in sizes, the secondary and the primary set. And so, when in most of these blocks, you have to wait for the secondary set, because that is going to be that is going to be the major crop provider this season, because of the amount of loss we had in the primary set. And so you will have to wait until the secondary kings reach at least 12 mm in size before you apply your thinning spray. So for central and northern Pennsylvania, it could be that this weekend is not the right time to thin, depending on where the sizes of your fruitlets are. It could be because for some varieties, like for example in this Honeycrisp block, the fruitlets are going to grow, and by the time they reach this Saturday, we are most likely going to be the secondary kings at 10 to 12 millimeters, in which case you can thin that block. But for other varieties, for example, this Gala, which is at 3 millimeters, it's unlikely that it will reach 12 millimeters by this Saturday. So you might have to wait a little bit more to sort of get to thinning them, maybe sometime mid next week to later next week. So that is why it's important to sort of look at the sizes of where some of these blocks are, to assess what you want to do with these blocks.
Okay. Thanks, Sean. That was really comprehensive. Yeah, I think I sent you some stuff this morning about how we are looking like we're between like 10 to 12 millimeters, but yeah, it's still pretty few and far between when it comes to actual fruitlets. So
Yeah, thanks, Don. I just wanted to mention one more thing. Because in some orchards we are seeing growing fruitlets, but when you cut open the fruitlets, we are seeing the damage, the central cavity and the seed cavity, and these fruits, depending on the amount of damage, they're most likely going to drop. But some fruitlets, especially ones that have been sprayed with Perlan or Promelin, there is a chance, and which fruitlets have minimal damage. They do have damage, but not as much, and they have been sprayed with Promelin or Perlan. There is a chance that these fruitlets could likely also last and keep growing, but they will still have that decayed seed cavity even if the fruit is growing, and so you just be aware of that. If you are planning to take these fruits to harvest, then accordingly you will have to deal with the fruit because they're most likely not going to store well. First of all, a lot of these fruit is going to fall off. If they don't fall off, then you must be aware of this when you're looking at fruitlets and when you're thinking of what to do with these fruit, because some of these fruit, because of the how they're growing, I feel like some of these damaged fruits could actually continue growing as long as they have even a small connection, vasculature connection with the tissue. These fruits could grow still, and so you should be aware that even though it has a damage in the center, in the seed cavity, it could still grow, but it will still have that decayed seed cavity even as it grows. It's not going to go away, and so it might be that those damaged fruit could go for juicing or something that could be sold immediately. That's just something to keep in mind as you're evaluating your blocks for damage. And we saw this damage in quite a few places around the state. And as of late last week, some of these damaged fruitlets are still growing. They're still on the tree, they're still growing, and it could take anywhere still. Hopefully, this warm weather will help in this weekend to sort of fasten the drop from these damaged fruitlets so that we're not confused by what's going to stick, what's not going to stick. But it could still take another week, another 2 weeks for all of those damaged fruitlets to drop off, especially during the June drop, which in southern Pennsylvania we seem to have the June drop mostly in mid to late May, and so or late May at least. So we'll have to wait until then to sort of understand if these fruitlets are going to drop or they're going to stay on.
Gary,
Okay, so interesting week, or I should say week to 10 days ahead of us. So I'm going to cover the next for this week and next week because it sort of all blends together. So first, over the weekend, we did have another scab infection event, and this might have also been a Marsanina event as well, Marsanina leaf blotch. So just as a reminder for Marsanina, we are in peak time for Marsanina spores, and they are still a threat to your apple trees, regardless if you have fruit on them or not, because it goes to the leaves. So Marsanina infection favors 68 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. You don't need very many leaf wetness hours. You only need a minimum of 4. And right now, your broad spectrum fungicides like Mancozeb, or if you're using Captan right now, that works. But your FRAC Group 3 and FRAC Group 7 fungicides are your go-tos. So this is your Sevion, Inspire Super, and Procure, and Trionic, and Lunaflex, and Tesseris, and Aprovia. That's just a snapshot of them. So these all work, especially when you're tank mixing with a Rainfast Mancozeb. Now, for those of you who may not have a crop and don't want to pull out the big guns to add to your Mancozeb, you can tank mix. You can do a few things. One, if you don't have a crop and you do want to use another fungicide in addition to your broad spectrum, you can also use something like Luna Sensation and Maravon. They have FRAC 7s in them. They will also help, but the FRAC 11s in them will not. So just as something just to make you aware of. If you do have fruit, I would not use those products. I would save the FRAC 11s for the summer. So that's your Luna Sensation, Maravon, Flynn Extra, and Cabrio. So And also the Frac 11s don't touch Marsanina, which is another reason to kind of save them for later. But like I said, if you don't have fruit and this is in your shed, you can still use this on your leaves. Now you may want to be conservative. Maybe you're planning on already being conservative because you have lost your crop. So one thing I would recommend during this time is using a tank mix of mancozeb and Captan. So maybe not using mancozeb alone and maybe adding a little more oomph. So if you use a rainfast mancozeb and Captan, the idea is you get the spreadability of Captan and the stickability of mancozeb. They use this combination a lot in New York. It's called Captozeb. It does a really good job. But remember, it is only effective as far as how you use it. So some things to keep in mind, some very important points when you're using just broad spectrums right now to keep your trees protected. Because I've heard some folks say, oh, when there was a year I didn't have fruit, I used this and it failed miserably. Well, it's probably how you used it. So remember, these broad spectrums are surface only, and for them to work effectively, they need to be on the surface of the plant tissue prior to that infection event. There is going to be no reach back activity, like your single modes of actions from your frac 3s and 7s and 9s, etc. So another thing is that when you put those broad spectrums on, and you're using alternate row middle, remember that the other side is naked. And you also have to remember it may be naked through a wetting event. So be mindful of how long your interval is in between those half sprays. That's very, very important. Also, be mindful of at the time of the rainfall or infection event, how recent was that broad spectrum application? Was it old? Was it sprayed just yesterday? It's the how when it was applied is going to determine its efficacy. If it's 2 weeks old, it may not be as potent as when it was just a few days old on the as far as on the tree. Also be mindful the trees are growing right now, so they're pushing out a lot of new tissue. So if you're putting on a spray and significant time has passed, you may have new growth, so that new growth may be unprotected. So these are things to really keep in mind when you're just using the broad spectrum fungicides due to a low or no crop, that there are limits to them. But you can use them smartly and get away with not having to pull out the big guns and adding them to your broad spectrum. So just a lot of things to keep in mind, especially if you're using alternate row middle sprays. Which again, I don't advocate, but I know the reality out there. So just be very mindful of that. Also, for when we're talking about leaves, don't forget your tart cherry trees. We're an active cherry leaf spot. You're going to have to still be spraying through the post-harvest period. I use that in quotes, even if you may not have sour cherries, because it's still attacking the leaves and can cause severe defoliation. So as far as the leaves goes, we're at the end of apple scab. This is probably the last week, the last push. We're at the end of rust. The rust galls are still active. They'll probably dry up come next week. And Marsanina, we're like right in the middle of it. So you're still going to have to be vigilant for Marsanina, probably for another month, I would say. Now, moving on to bitter rot. So bitter rot, if you have fruit, we will most likely have our first major infection event this week. Remember, bitter rot likes it warm. It also has a quiescent period when it causes its initial infection. So it's very important to have those fungicides on the tree prior to the infection event. So things to be thinking about what to apply right now. Approvia would be a great option to tank mix with your rainfast mancozeb. Approvia is great. It's a frac 7. It's great against bitter rot, and it's also great against Marsanina. You could also use Omega, and that's fluazinam. So frac group 29, that's also Orbis. That's also another name for the product, and there may be other names out there for fluazinam. So this has both Approvia and Omega have like a 28-day to 30-day PHI. So this is the time you want to be using it. I would probably hold off on your Frac 11s, the Flynn Extra, the Luna Sensation, Maravon, Cabrio, just because we're in the middle of Marsanina. So I would use something different. So you could kind of really beef up your broad spectrums with the mancozeb Captan. That would probably work as well. And as far as Topsin is another one, or Fontellus, they are a bit weaker, but they will do the job, especially when they're tank mixed with a broad spectrum. So I always mention about Frac 11s being great for rots, but just because we're in the Marsanina period, I would still wait on them and push them to a little bit later. As far as organic options, they are limited. We've got Howler out there, Serenade ASO, Opti, Double Nickel, OSO. So these products alone are fairly weak, unfortunately. So if you need a good organic control for your OMRI certified site, you probably want to stick to sulfur for a while for with regards to bitter rot control. You could think about rotating these products like Howler, Double Nickel, Serenade, ASO, or Opti. They're a lot softer and they need a little bit of extra help when managing disease because they get overwhelmed by the disease pressure so easily. So you could think of a rotational program and maybe rotating sulfur in these products. That's also an option. I was just on a recent phone call with some Ohio growers, kind of giving them some bitter rot advice. And one thing I forgot to mention that I'm glad a grower brought up was regalia. So many folks have seen the sort of the utility of regalia, adding regalia, not using it by itself, but adding it to your spray mix. So what does regalia do? What's so special about it? So this is a plant extract. It thickens the plant cell walls. And so it's this mode of action that probably why we see an additive effect or maybe a synergistic effect with conventional fungicides because it thickens the plant cell walls. And so if the plant cell walls are thicker, fungi can't penetrate it as easily. And so that may be why it's working so well is because of this mode of action. So that is another option as well. 1 to 2 quarts per acre, adding it to your mix, not using it in lieu of or by itself, because again, it will get overwhelmed, but using it as an additive. And you can use it in every single tank mix. So this is something else is maybe I haven't tried this. We tried this many years ago and we didn't see any statistical differences, but I think if we would do this again during especially maybe a severe year that we may see things sort of settle out a bit differently. But this is something, if it were my orchard, I would do because of the way that regalia works. So this is also something to think about. And we will revisit it. But I just want to emphasize for folks, this did go out in the disease update that was sent out this morning, and I just want to emphasize we are in the bitter rot zone for infection right now. The temperatures are warm. They're getting warmer, and rain is in the forecast. So we need to be on high alert for bitter rot infections, and I cannot emphasize that enough because last year people were caught off guard by these early infections, and it kind of ruined the rest of the season because they saw infection later on. Once you see infection, that's it. There's no going back because there's most likely latent infections. And you need that fungicide on ahead of time because of the way this fungus causes infections. When it causes infections, it goes asleep. It goes latent. And when it's latent and asleep, fungicides can't attack it easily. And this is in contrast to other diseases or fungi, like the one that causes apple scab, Venturi iniqualis. That doesn't go asleep once it starts infection. It continues the process. So it's easy to use fungicides to kill it or use this reach back mechanism of fungicides. We can't really bank on that with regards to bitter rot. You're better off having it on ahead of time. Don't count on fungicides working 100% post the infection event. So I can't emphasize that enough. So people need to be on high alert really over the next 10 days. The last thing I want to mention is fire blight. So I'm starting to hear, as I basically was setting my watch to it, of really a lot of high incidents out there that people are seeing of blossom blight. And I knew it was only a matter of time. The cool weather was holding things back. So what can you do? So some tips. First, it's still not too late to use the prohexadione calcium. So Apogee or Kudos. So especially for people who may have a low or no crop. Just be mindful that this product will interfere with your thinning, so plan accordingly with it. And when I'm done with the fire blight, I'll let Sean comment about Prohex and thinning chemicals because that's not my wheelhouse and I don't want to say anything inappropriate. But the peroxidone calcium will harden off the shoots and that will limit shoot blight, so this is important. As far as other products you may be able to use to stop fire blight in its tracks. So right now, preventative may be out the door. So you're now chasing the infections. So applying anything may be really difficult right now. But if you want to use something that could help stop the fire blight that you see, I'm going to mention a product. Now, I am in the process of just disclosure, the little disclaimer statement I should say in the beginning is that I'm testing this product this year. So I do not have data in hand. So this is from more anecdotal evidence. So I've mentioned this earlier, the product Fungout, which is citric acid. It's 1.07% citric acid, and this product is considered a fungicide and bactericide. So how would this work for fire blight and managing active fire blight? Erwinia amylavera, the causal agent, the causal bacteria of fire blight, does not like acidic environments. It hates it when it's acidic. And I can say this firsthand because when our fire blight or Erwinia media has been off in the lab, it will not grow if that media is not at neutral. If it's at 5.5, it will not grow. So Erwinia really hates acidity, acidic environments. So how would this work is that you're spraying an acid, on your trees. And this should not harm the fruit finish issues in theory, or the leaves. It's no different than adding probably an acidifier like Li 700 to your spray tank. But you don't need to add any adjuvants. You could add a spreader sticker to this to sort of aid in the spreadability. It says this on the label. But if you have an active infection, you could spray this, and maybe it will burn things out and stop the spread of the Erwinia. I've heard this anecdotally from growers saying this does work. I cannot attest to it because I'm actively trying it right now. So we shall see. But I would say, in theory, this should work based on what we know of what Erwinia does in acidic environments. It doesn't like it. And the fact that that's what this is doing. It's an acidifier. And so if you're desperate and you're like, we'll try anything, this is something. The rate that you use is 1.4% volume to volume, and you would do this every 2 to 3 days. That's what the label says. I'm quoting the label. So this is something that's not just one and done. You're going to really have to monitor, and you may have to go in multiple times. So use this at your own discretion because I don't have data to back it up just yet. But again, in theory and thinking things out, this might be a worthy option. Again, if it were me and I would be in this position and knowing what I know, I would try it. Especially if I have too much to prune out, this would be something that I definitely would want to look at. So just a word, just again, use it at your own discretion. Now, if you are going to plan on cutting out fire blight, a triage method. There's a triage method that you want to follow. So first, the highest priority orchards are those that are young. So 3 to 8 orchards with a few strikes. So few strikes means single digits. So like 1 to 3, 4. Anything if you're getting close to 10, that's too many. And so that would be the next level. If younger orchards with a lot of strikes, older orchards with a few strikes, and the walk away orchards are those that have so many strikes that basically you're going to be cutting out the majority of the tree or stumping it if they're young trees. Just walk away. I know that might be hard, but the reason why you want to walk away from these orchards is that too much of a good thing could really negatively impact you as far as pruning. So the more you prune, the more you're going to tell that tree, I need to put out new shoots. Because you're removing the apical dominance of all those branches. So it's going to want to produce more and more shoots. And that's just going to create the problem to be worse and worse and worse because you're giving it more young tissue to grow and to become infected because that fire blight now is actively in the trees. So you're going to want to walk away from those orchards that may have a lot of fire blight. Now, if you are going to cut out fire blight, some things you want to keep in mind. Don't cut out infections in wet weather. So be mindful of what it is. And that includes dewy mornings. You want it dry because the wetter it is, the more you're going to spread that bacteria around. You want to cut active infections out as early as possible. So once it gets real crunchy, that's usually a little too late as far as to limit the spread. Pruning is most effective when the incidence is low. You want to salvage tree structure, especially in young high density plantings. And be mindful that bacteria can invade the tissue up to 3 feet or more. So sterilizing your tools might be a moot point. But if you see active oozing, uh, this may be warrant some, this may warrant some sterilization or at least some cleaning up of the tools in between cuts. So you may be reluctant to use bleach because that's hard against steel and metals. So if you use something like peroxide or pine sol or something that's a little gentler on tools, that's something to consider. But again, the bacteria is moving ahead of the infection. So sterilization, it's a hot topic and can be controversial. Personally, I don't during the season, but that's just me. Some people feel a lot better sterilizing. You do you. I'm not going to discourage you. Practice the ugly stub method. So you want to aim for 6 to 12 inches beyond the site of infection. Leave a stub because it's the stub is where the bacteria is going to collect and you can come out in the winter and prune it. And then ideally, you want to remove the tissue from the orchard, but I know that can be challenging, especially with labor and maybe reduced crews. So what can you do alternatively to limit spread? Well, throw it in the tree row middles, let it dry out, and then mow over it and crunch it up and chop everything up into little pieces. That's what we do at Freck, especially for little stuff. For big branches, no, you can't do that. You would want to remove those big things from the orchard. But for little things, just throw it in the row middle, let it dry up, and then just mow over it to crunch it up. The last thing I will mention about management is the ActiGuard paint method, and I'm using paint as a verb, not as like mixing something with latex. You're using it as basically a spray. It's a concentrated spray for the tree of ActiGuard. So it is you are mixing 1 ounce of ActiGuard in 1 quart of a 1% penetrant. So that can be Pentrabark, that can be Li 700. But what you're going to do is if you have limited strikes on your trees, you make up a bunch of this. And so like 1 quart will treat approximately 5 cuts. I usually make it up into like a 1 gallon. I use a handheld 1 gallon sprayer for ease. You're going to cut basically make the pruning cut, and I spray the cut and then also the trunk right below that. And so what this research has shown, this came out of Oregon State, is that this should limit canker production and also limit spread of the bacteria further into the tree. So it is a little laborious, so I'd recommend doing it in teams if you do it, but it does work. I've used this in the past when I've had really tough situations. So I do advocate it, but it is a little bit of extra work. So you want to kind of do it in a tag team, maybe someone who's cutting and then someone's coming in and spraying. So it's just an idea. And then the last thing that I will mention, and I'm going to try to get this article republished this week, is for folks who really are hit hard to not forget about the Farm Service TAP program, the Tree Assistant Program. And so this program will aid growers who've been hit by some natural disaster in their perennial crop. So whether it's grapevines or trees, you can contact a farm service agency and make a claim. But there is a period of time that you have, a window. So if you have a really overwhelming situation that the only way to fix this is to remove a huge chunk of your orchard, contact FSA. You will get compensated for a portion of what you lost as far as the trees to replace and the labor that it takes that's necessary. Something's better than nothing, especially if you're faced with fire blight and having the need to replace it and also stopping it in its tracks. This has been successful for several growers I've worked with. Sometimes you need like someone to be an expert and provide a letter saying, this is what happened, these were the conditions. The growers did everything they could humanly possibly do, and it still happened. And this was a year where TAP should be taken advantage of if people really were hit hard, because we had the absolute worst week for conditions for fire blight. And it was unreal. So this would warrant making a claim for TAP. So I would encourage growers to do that. And I'm going to try to get this. We published this article, Jay Harper and I, many years ago, but that article is no longer on the extension website. So I'm going to try to I'm going to update it and republish it later this week for any growers out there because I have a feeling some people may need that this year. So, with that, I thought this was going to be short, but those are the very long, broad brushstrokes for what people need to be thinking about over the next 10 days. And I say the next 10 days because I'm going to be at a conference next week. So I want to make sure that people have their information of what's going to cover this week and next week. So before we finally wrap up, I just want to have an addendum and have Sean address the use of the prohexadione calcium that I mentioned to be used for fire blight and how that may or may not interact with thinning. So I'm going to have Sean describe that.
Thanks, Terry. So when I looked at the literature, it's a little bit mixed on this, where some folks have observed that it is slightly harder to thin, and anecdotally, I've heard from multiple growers that when they've applied really high rates of apogee, or kudos, which is the 10 to 12 ounces rate, that sometimes it's a little bit harder to thin because you don't have as much vegetative growth happening, and so it's not like the tree's resources are being directed towards vegetative growth, and so there's availability of resources. There's carbohydrates, and so when you have that, it makes it harder to have a carbohydrate deficit, which makes it slightly harder to thin, especially when the shoots are hardened off. But there's evidence. There's not clear evidence either way, and I think that there's needs to be more work to sort of like clearly say one way or the other. But it's just something to be mindful of when using high rates of apogee and with thinning chemicals, and especially for Adams County, I think we'll get past most of those concerns by the end of this week because this week will be the main thinning window this Saturday.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, thanks. I also just wanted to quickly mention that I got some questions from growers about irrigation and what to do with irrigation with low or no crop, especially in your high density blocks. And so I just wanted to address that. I just remembered is that so when you have rainfall occurring like every week, and when you have enough moisture in the soil for sustenance of the crop, then when you don't have a crop and when you have a vigorous high density planting, I would highly suggest you regulate your irrigation that you have. It is not necessary to irrigate if you have low to a no crop. The only exception to that is when you have really hot weather and you want to mitigate the stress of that heat, then yes, it will be good to irrigate if you have irrigation and drip irrigation. But especially during the times when you have flowering initiation of flowering that happens for the crop of the next year. So the flower initiation inside, I mean, we don't see it, but it happens within 45 days after full bloom for Honeycrisp, within between 45 to 60 days of full bloom for Fuji, and about 90 to 100 days after full bloom for Gala. And so during these times, it's important that the tree doesn't face additional stress. And so if you do have irrigated blocks, it's important to provide irrigation during those times and during times when it's very hot outside, because it does lead to cooling. But other than that, if you have a vigorous block and you want to limit its growth, then I think it's important to sort of limit the irrigation that you provide. Maybe you could reduce it by 50 to 70%, and just have a sort of like maintenance irrigation schedule, meaning that you provide water when if you have sensors to help you with it, either evapotranspiration or soil moisture sensor to kind of guide your applications. You can reduce your irrigation by about 50 to 70%, except for these two exceptions that I talked about, so that you're not growing your shoots too long, such that it exceeds the space that it has in the high density block. And irrigation can do that. So you might want to change that if you have irrigation settings set up as compared to like a normal year. So that's something I wanted to say. Thanks.
Well, thank you guys both so much for jumping on here today and doing this. And we will return next week, I guess, barring any major catastrophes. So, I nope, I still have one more week before I need to encourage folks to come to the Mid-Atlantic fruit and vegetable planting session that we have down at Freck. which is on the 27th, just as a heads up for folks. So that said, if you're in the local region and you want to come to that and have input on what the educational program looks like for Mid-Atlantic, feel free to swing by. Let me know.
Yeah, and growers are encouraged. It's
100%.
just, yeah, it's just not the extension folks that are, invited. It's we want to hear from the growers. We develop the program based on what your interests and needs are. So,
Absolutely. All right. So with that, say goodbye.
goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.